Good afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on May 22nd, 2024. And today I'm pleased to be joined by Alexander Mercouris. Alexander is a geopolitical analyst based in the United Kingdom. And on the Duran, which is available on numerous platforms, Alexander and his colleague Alex Christoforou offer highly original and very insightful analysis about international affairs. I've watched many of their discussions and learned a great deal from them over the years. And theirs I find to be a rational, fact-based analysis that one rarely finds nowadays in the so-called mainstream media. And so with no further ado, thank you very much for joining me today, Alexander.
It's my very great pleasure. I'm delighted to be speaking together, and I hope more than once, but this time the first.
I too. So let me start, even though I indicated when I reached out to you that I wanted to talk about West Asia, and that will be the focus of our discussion today. I first wanted to ask you about a subject that I know you care about deeply, and I certainly do, and that is the subject of the fate of Julian Assange. And just by way of background, since 2019, Mr. Assange has been languishing in the notorious Belmarsh prison in the United Kingdom, fighting an extradition proceeding which seeks his removal to the United States. And there he faces various charges related to espionage that could doom him to a lifetime in prison, or perhaps even worse, the death penalty. And what is his alleged crime? In essence, his crime is journalism, and more particularly, his exposure in his capacity as a journalist of U.S. war crimes in Iraq. Now, on Monday of this week, Alexander, when many thought that Mr. Assange was going to be handed over to U.S. Marshals and spirited off to the U.S., two senior British judges ruled that Mr. Assange had, in fact, a further right of appeal. What can you tell us about what those two judges, in fact, decided, and what do you think motivated them to make this somewhat surprising decision?
The thing to understand is that this is a very complex legal process. It has been made impossibly complex and extremely protracted, I suspect, because of uncertainty on the part of the British judiciary about how to handle this case. Can I, before I proceed, say that I've actually worked in the Royal Courts of Justice where all of these events have happened. I used to be a lawyer there, and I remember the times well, and I remember the procedures, and a lot has happened in this case, which is so procedurally strange to me that I have sometimes difficulty understanding it, because the judges have behaved in what I can only describe at times as an unorthodox way. But briefly, what has happened is this. There was a case, an extradition case, which was brought by the United States. Assange and his lawyers contested it. There was a long trial in the Magistrates' Court in Westminster. This is outside the Royal Courts of Justice. The magistrate in the Westminster Magistrates' Court decided that the United States had made a legal case for Assange's extradition, something which was very controversial. All kinds of decisions were made over the course of that case. For example, that the magistrate said that you could extradite people to the United States on political charges, which I think shocked a lot of people because it's completely contrary to the British legal tradition to do that. However, the magistrate also said that Mr. Assange should not be extradited to the United States on health grounds. Anyway, after that event, there have been two attempts to appeal the magistrate's decision. The first was an appeal brought by the United States, in which the United States said that the magistrate's concerns about his health grounds, were misplaced, because the United States was prepared to provide assurances that he would be treated humanely if he arrived in the United States, if he was sent to the United States. To many people's surprise, the United States won that appeal. What we are now seeing, what is happening at the moment in the Royal Courts of Justice, is Julian Assange's own appeal against the decision of the magistrate that all of the other grounds, the grounds for extradition, or allowing Mr. Assange to be sent to the United States, that the United States had met those. So if you remember, the magistrate said he can't be sent, but it's only on health grounds. In all other respects, he can be sent to the United States. So Mr. Assange has argued that was wrong. His lawyers have argued that was wrong. And yesterday, after much doubt and hesitancy and prevarication, the judges in the Royal Courts of Justice said, right, he's got grounds of appeal. There are some reasons to think that the magistrate made a mistake, and therefore we're going to allow him leave to appeal. Now, if I can ask you for just one moment of further patience, because as I said, this is a complicated case.
Sure.
The judges in the High Court, I think, were very reluctant yesterday to make that order. I think the British judiciary are very embarrassed by this case. I think they're very embarrassed by the publicity it's received. I think they also are under a lot of political pressure to send Mr. Assange to the United States. They did not want to make the order they made yesterday, but they made, and in order to avoid making that order, they took what is for me the almost unprecedented step before yesterday's hearing of asking the United States to provide assurances that if Mr. Assange were sent to the United States, then he would be able to rely on the protections a journalist has under the First Amendment of the Constitution. The United States was incapable of providing full assurances because they said that since he is not an American citizen, it will be for the court to decide whether or not he can rely on the protections of the First Amendment. So very reluctantly, very grudgingly, because of this, the court in London yesterday decided that he should be granted leave to appeal. Leave to appeal because they said that if he's not entitled to protections under the First Amendment, then there might be a violation of his rights of free speech as a journalist under Article 10 of the human rights of the European Convention of Human Rights if he's extradited to the United States. This is a very simple explanation of the legal proceedings up to now and of the decision.
I'd like to put to you one that's perhaps even more simple, and see whether you find it to be a credible hypothesis as to what is going on. And that is a perspective that Ray McGovern expressed, I believe it was yesterday or Monday, on Judging Freedom, when he was asked by Judge Napolitano what is really going on here. He had no hesitation in saying that this is all just a scam. He didn't, I'm paraphrasing, of course, he didn't say scam, but effectively what is going on is that the British and the Americans are conniving to prolong the internment of Julian Assange for as long as possible, hoping that he'll just eventually die in a British prison. And they would prefer that that happen rather than that he be brought to the United States, where he might actually be able to, for example, invoke the First Amendment. And that this is just a game of prolonging his torture, frankly. Do you think there's any that could be an explanation for all of these oddities that you're seeing in this proceeding, these unprecedented aspects of the proceeding? Or do you think that that's really a far-fetched view that is unlikely to be an explanation?
I'm sorry to say it is not a far-fetched view at all. Many people think that. Many people in Britain have come to think that. They've watched this incredibly convoluted legal process, and they're saying to themselves, this has to be the explanation, that they don't really want him to go to the United States. They're worried that if he does go to the United States, he might be successful on First Amendment grounds. They are worried also. They also think that there might even be a further subtext to this, that they want to keep him in Britain until after the election in November, so that his arrival in the United States isn't an embarrassment to Joe Biden, who is the person the British collectively, the entire British establishment, very much want to win. And to repeat, this has been an extremely bizarre, very unorthodox case. I take a different view. And I think the reason the British case has been so protracted and so long is because the British judges have been presented with a problem. This is that the law clearly points in one direction, which is to extradite, to absolutely refuse the extradition of Mr. Assange to the United States. He should not be extradited to the United States. That is the legal tradition in Britain on these kind of charges. It is also, to a great extent, what the law says. But on the other hand, they want to extradite him to the United States. They're under pressure to do so. The entire British state wants to do so. The British judges, to be straightforward about it, are conservative people. They don't really like very much what Mr. Assange has been doing. So they're caught between their desire to extradite him and their duty as judges not to do so. And this is what is creating all this tension. This is why we had the judge in the magistrate's court originally say, well, the Americans have got it all completely right, but we can't extradite him because of health grounds, which is an elegant way of getting out of the problem. Then the judges in the higher court said, well, actually the health grounds don't apply. We'll accept the promises of the United States that he'll be treated well. You shouldn't be accepting promises at all at that stage in the litigation. It's far too late in the litigation to be accepting promises. And the United States could have made those promises at any time before, but they did it after the trial. But anyway, so they said, maybe he can be extradited to the United States after all. And now, of course, they are confronted with the heart of the issue, which is that it turns out that if he's sent to the United States, he might not be able to rely on the First Amendment protection after all, because the authorities in the United States, the intelligence community in the United States, which is driving this, really doesn't want people who are not Americans to be able to rely on the First Amendment. They want to be able to bring them to the United States and try them and lock them up and say that the First Amendment doesn't apply. And that, of course, would be a catastrophic thing, because there is no public interest defense to prosecutions under the Espionage Act in the United States. You can't say that it's in the public interest that this information can be provided. So the only protection journalists have is the First Amendment of the Constitution. But the American authorities say, if you're not American, you can't rely on it. So if you do what Mr. Assange has done, then you've got no protection in the United States at all. You have no First Amendment protection, no public interest protection. And so the British are now finding themselves, well, look, we've got this. We've also got to worry about a possible further appeal if we decide to extradite him to the United States. A further appeal by Mr. Assange's lawyers. They've indicated they're going to do this to the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights is perfectly capable of saying, hold on, this violates his human rights, his protections for free speech under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And if you've extradited him to the United States and he's facing trial there and is in prison, because you've violated his human rights, you've got to bring him back. There is case authority that can happen. They've made the European Court of Human Rights has made orders like that in the past. So they're trapped. They're trapped between the law, and their own desires. And this is what I think explains all of this complexity and all of this convoluted litigation and these very strange and unorthodox decisions. If my analysis is correct, by the way, which I think it is, because I've worked in this environment, I know some of the people involved. I think that actually gives some grounds for hope, because through gritted teeth, they've had to grant Assange leave to appeal. It is obviously on a very narrow point, the First Amendment and human rights, but it's a point which, in some respects, you could say is the heart of the case. So now we're going to have a hearing in the High Court about those very issues. And if you look at the reasons for which leave to appeal was granted, it's difficult to see logically how the appeal itself can fail. You would say that on the basis of what they've decided in yesterday's hearing, they really have to allow the appeal when it comes and refuse the extradition request. So, I'm not saying it's going to happen, because as I said, so many odd things have happened in the case up to now. But I personally think that is a more likely explanation than the explanation that people like Ray are coming up with. I mean, that's my own view.
Right. Well, let us hope that ultimately the judge's duty to uphold the law will prevail over their ideological inclinations. So with that, I'd like to turn to West Asia and start our discussion by talking about another major legal development on Monday. I mean, Monday was quite a day for those of us who follow geopolitics. And that was the announcement by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, that he was seeking arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, and 3 senior Hamas officials. And Alexander, before I ask you my question, I want to preface that I have a very dim view as a lawyer of what Mr. Khan has done. And I'll summarize it for you thus. I believe that in effect, he has done the absolute bare minimum under circumstances of enormous pressure. He waited for some 7 months in circumstances where it was quite clear to many jurists around the world that what was unfolding was a genocide. He waited for 4 months after the International Court of Justice ruled overwhelmingly, with the concurrence of every Western-based judge, that it was plausible that Israel was violating the Genocide Convention. And he has limited his allegations against Netanyahu and Gallant and against the Israeli leadership generally to an absurd degree, in my view. He has not accused them of genocide, despite the decision of the ICJ. He has limited the region and the period of time of his indictments to post-October 7th and the Gaza Strip. This means probably that the allegation of apartheid, which has been well documented by Western and Israeli human rights organizations, is off the table. Certainly, there's no indication that he's charging them with the crime of apartheid. This means that the settlements in the West Bank are off the table. And also, he has left untouched all the other members of Netanyahu's cabinet, including the most extreme of them, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who have been openly fulminating about their genocidal intent all these months. And he's focused his attention, frankly, on the 2 Israeli members of that cabinet who probably have no political future when this war is over. Netanyahu and Gallant were both in charge of security when October 7th happened, which is a tremendous black mark on their record as 2 persons who were committed to the security of Israel. But also Netanyahu is facing corruption charges. And once he finds himself out of office, there's a high risk he's going to end up in an Israeli jail. And these are the 2 people that Karim Khan decided to go after. So for all of these reasons and others, I have a rather dim view of this, although I do think it's better than no indictment at all, to be sure. And with that, I'd like to ask you about Karim Khan. As I understand it, the man's a British barrister. He became the ICC prosecutor in 2021. His candidacy for that post was heavily promoted, according to reports in the British press, by the government of the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who I think can fairly be described as pro-Israel and a neocon. And at the time that Khan was elected to this position, The Economist reported that the Johnson government was, quote, cock-a-hoop that Khan had won. I don't know what cock-a-hoop means, but I'm gathering that it means something along the lines of ecstatic. So in any event, if Boris Johnson's government was pleased to see Karim Khan put in this quite important position, I think that would bode ill for the enforcement of international law. So I'd like to start by asking you, what do you know about Karim Khan? What can you tell us about him? And do you think he can be relied upon to vigorously prosecute Netanyahu and Gallant and pursue them as expeditiously as possible until justice is done?
Right. What I know about Karim Khan is that he's a very political lawyer from that part of the English bar, which is very political. That's the first thing to say. I mean, very much. There is a kind of subsection of the British legal establishment which has gone into human rights law in a big way, and some of them have gone about it in a very proper, serious way, but I have to say some of them less so. So I think he's a very much a political lawyer. That is what I've heard. And he's also a very politically well-connected lawyer. His brother has been, I don't think he still is, but has been a Conservative MP. So you can see that there are all kinds of connections. He's connected to the ruling Conservative Party. So there are very good reasons why Boris Johnson, and you're absolutely right, cock-a-hoop means ecstatic. It's the kind of public school word for it that someone like Boris Johnson probably would use, and it might even be what he himself said. But you can understand why the British so heavily promoted him and pushed him so hard to become pushed so hard for him to become chief prosecutor at the ICC. So that's who Karim Khan is. And again, and this is my take, which is very similar to yours, about essentially the same as yours about this, is that Karim Khan has had to do this. Again, it's a question of a conflict between what he would prefer to do, which is to do nothing, to sit on his hands, as he's been doing for months, effectively, let events in Gaza, take their course, do absolutely nothing, and what the law requires him to do, which is to, do what he eventually very grudgingly and very carefully and very reluctantly decided to do, and which we saw yesterday, which is to issue these 2 arrest warrants. It's essentially not that different from the Assange case that we were discussing a moment ago. And I think the reason it's happened is, again, pure politics. The law is very clear about what's been happening in Gaza. We saw that in the International Court of Justice, where a much older, far more well-established court with a very much stronger jurisprudence, if I have to say, than the ICC obviously has. So we saw what has been working through there. It's clear what's been going on in Gaza itself. We've had a massive, unending succession of statements from Israeli officials, which have been horrifying. I mean, they've been openly using genocidal language, and they've been doing it even after the case in the International Court of Justice began. I mean, they've been showing a recklessness in and a sense of overweening confidence that they'd be able to get away with this kind of thing. That is astonishing, and of course the problem is that the credibility of the ICC itself has been gradually melting away. It's been hanging by a thread. We've had lots of complaints already, even before the Gaza crisis began, from the African states, that this has just become a court that is only interested in what Africans are doing, never goes on after Western officials or friends of the United States or anything like that. They then issued this warrant against Vladimir Putin of Russia on child abduction issues, which again some of us might find rather strange. And again, we would some of us wonder why they got round the jurisdiction issue in the way that they did, because
Right.
anyway, there was
And
some
no one,
discussion about
Even the fiercest enemies of Vladimir Putin don't allege that he's massacred over 15,000 Ukrainian children.
Well, well, exactly. Well, exactly. That's the point. So, I mean, we got now, this massive horror going on in Gaza, and countries around the world have been saying, what is the prosecutor doing? Why is the ICC doing absolutely nothing? So he's got to try and square that circle. He doesn't want to go here. He knows that if he issues warrants against any Israeli officials at all, it'll be very embarrassing for the United States, very embarrassing for Western governments. He doesn't want to do that. At the same time, he's got to do something, or probably that's what he feels, or the reputation of the court of which he is a part will go up in smoke. So he's done exactly what you said. He's done the bare minimum. He's thrown Netanyahu and Gallant, if you like, a bone to the wolves that are chasing him. And that's what it feels like to me. And if you listened to him, because he gave this extraordinary, solemn statement, looking very unhappy, I thought, by the way, as well. I mean, certainly not confident and brimming with confidence about this. Anyway, he went through it all, explaining, we've got to do this, and justice has to be impartial and has to be administered in an impartial way, and all but admitting the political pressures upon himself. So, we can't be affected by political pressures. So a purely political decision made by a deeply politicized court, and one which is being done to rescue its already disintegrating credibility, even as the horror in Gaza continues. And I have to say, and I think this is a point which many people haven't yet understood. Of course, this is just a decision of the prosecutor. What the judges are going to decide is a different matter, because it has to go to them now. They're going to be now under tremendous pressure. And up to now, every judicial panel in the ICC has eventually agreed to a request to issue warrants made by the prosecutor. But they can prolong this. They can delay this for months or weeks or years, even. It's happened. I'm not saying they will. We'll see, because, of course, there's also the contrary pressures as well. But it's quite obvious to me that, again, they've had to do what they didn't want to do, but which events in the Middle East, in Gaza, on the Palestinian territories, have forced them to do. And by the way, if you read his statement, you could see, again, nothing at all about the Palestinian territories in Gaza, the settlements there. He did squirrel in a single reference to the West Bank, but
Right,
without
right.
following up on it. He said, well, we're going to go on looking. We're going to continue to think about, the effects of bombing and other things. But he doesn't really seem to be keen to go there either. And given that the bombing has been conducted in plain sight, and he mentioned in one place, very briefly, that one of the factors that has led him to do this is the comments made by the group that is conducting this collective punishment in Gaza of the Palestinian people. Now, what does that even mean? Does it mean, is the group does it just consist of Gallant and Netanyahu? Why not say that, the people who he's accusing, or does it include a larger number of people? Well, of course, we know that it does.
Mhm.
We know that Smotrich and Ben Gvir have been saying appalling things, even worse
Yeah.
than Gallant and Netanyahu have been saying. But if so, if it is intended to include them, then why have they not been indicted also? I mean, it's
Yes. And
a complete mess.
one might add, the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, his genocidal language was specifically quoted by the International Court of Justice, and his name is nowhere to be seen in this announcement either. I think, Alexander, that if the judges have the moral decency to grant the request for these arrest warrants, and I think Khan would be a cock-a-hoop if they refused his request, frankly. I'm going to go on a limb and make a prediction that this man, Netanyahu, will not be tried until he has either passed away from natural causes or is languishing in an Israeli jail for corruption. That's my bold prediction, and hopefully I'll be proven to be wrong. But in any case, I'd like to move on to events which are going to, I think, unfold at a much faster pace than the glacial ICC proceeding we're about to witness, and that is the military developments on the ground. And as we've all seen, those of us who are dealing in reality and not hype, despite 7 months of extraordinary levels of destruction in Gaza, it's quite clear that Hamas has not been defeated. And there's no indication that Hamas is close to defeat. And in fact, those of us who follow closely the statements by the Axis of Resistance, including the videos that they publish supporting their accounts of combat, it seems that the resistance within Gaza itself might have even intensified during the past 2 weeks, ever since the incursion into Rafah began. And then you have the northern border with Lebanon. The Hezbollah has been striking Israel, northern Israel, military targets and settlements every single day, virtually every single day, other than when there was a brief truce, and usually multiple times a day. And their videos show quite clearly that they are striking these targets with amazing accuracy. When you and I were younger, we would have seen quite predictably a ground incursion into South Lebanon by the Israeli military to put a stop to this. But they haven't even attempted a significant ground incursion in some 7 months. They've largely depopulated the north of Israel. The people who have been displaced are complaining loudly, saying they will not go back until Hezbollah is moved beyond the Litani River. There's no indication that Israel has the capacity to do that, or even the willingness, frankly, despite their bombastic language. Then you have what I think can fairly be described as a successful attack by Iran on a very, very well-defended military asset within Israel, the Nevatim Air Base. They managed to penetrate the air defenses of multiple countries and strike that air base with ballistic missiles. You have the attacks by Ansar Allah, which continue on Red Sea shipping that's affiliated or associated with Israel. And despite the sending of an armada, which included numerous European vessels to the Red Sea, there's no indication that those attacks have been stopped or can be stopped. And it seems to me that Israel is hurtling towards a strategic defeat, which is something that I argued very early on in this war. Do you see any realistic path to victory for Israel? And if not, how do you see this war coming to an end, as all wars eventually do?
You have put your finger on the actual reality, because obviously, we mustn't get ourselves distracted too much by the theatre in the ICC. It is important, but it's not the key issue. What the key revelation of this war has been, and something which the previous war, the war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, was pointing towards, but I think we are now there. There has been a massive shift in the balance of military power in the Middle East. I mean, I'm old enough to remember a time when Israel was all but invincible in the Middle East. It could launch strikes against Lebanon at will. It could march deep into Lebanese territory, and often did, with devastating effect. It could launch strikes deep into Syria. It could defeat Arab armies with ease.
It destroyed a nuclear power facility, or one that was under construction
In
in
Iraq
Yeah.
in 1981, the Osirik reactor.
Mhm.
That clearly doesn't apply anymore. It's, in fact, finding itself militarily on the defensive, on the strategic defensive. It's one of the reasons it is so aggressive in Gaza. One of the reasons its rhetoric has been so extreme is, I am sure, because Israeli officials sense their own weakness, and they sense that they are facing strategic dilemmas that they have no solution to. They have not been able to suppress Hamas in Gaza. They've committed huge numbers of troops, vast amounts of resources to crushing Hamas in Gaza. They've discovered that Hamas is extremely well organized, that it has strong support amongst the population in Gaza, that it's been preparing for this long struggle in Gaza. They're coming up in Gaza against the same problem that other, I'm going to say, colonial powers in the past have encountered when they've tried to suppress resistance movements in places like Gaza. If you want to get a sense of that, there's a wonderful French film, The Battle of Algiers, showing the fighting in Algeria in the in the 1950s and early 1960s, and you could see some of the same things repeating themselves in Gaza, but to multiple levels of intensity, but without any real success. I mean, the very fact that 7 months on from the start of this conflict, they're still talking about offensives in Rafah and such places is itself a sign of failure, of ultimate defeat. And of course, what they've been doing also has not just put them on a military strategic course of defeat, it's also destroyed Israel's global reputation. We see countries like Colombia, historic friends of Israel, becoming exasperated. We see in countries like China, which also used to have, by the way, surprisingly good relations with Israel at one time, especially in the later period of the Cold War. China has now joined in the proceedings in the International Court of Justice against Israel. We see India, formerly very supportive of Israel, because it also has had issues with Muslim opponents. Even India is now starting to sort of tip away. It has been a disaster, and there's been a disaster in terms of public opinion in Europe, in the United States. That's becoming deeply embarrassing for the governments of those countries. And the whole thing is a massive problem. But this Israeli government doesn't know how to get out of this problem, because this is something that they never imagined or could have conceived of. And beyond that, even if this government were to change, one fears that there is no conceivable other Israeli government that could take its place, which would find a solution to this problem either. Now, my own view is that eventually what is going to happen is that the United States is going to insist on a ceasefire in Gaza, because it doesn't want this thing continuing forever in this way. They, again, don't want to do this. They've been providing political cover for Israel in every conceivable way they have. They've been arming Israel in every conceivable way that they could do. But they're facing domestic pressures. They're facing international pressures. Part of the State Department is unhappy about what's going on. Part of the military, the Pentagon, is also unhappy about what is going on. They're on the defensive in the United Nations, which they don't like to be. So I think in the end, we are going to get an unsatisfactory ceasefire. Unsatisfactory because it won't resolve anything decisively. But it will be a victory for Hamas, and it will be the moment when Israel itself will find itself at the crossroads. Does it do that which it has never done in any serious or meaningful way since the time when the State of Israel was founded, which is seek a genuine and real peace? Or does it continue along the path that it has followed ever since its foundation? of pursuing maximalist goals, the establishment of a greater Israel, even as the wider geopolitical realities and the military balance turns against it. If it chooses the latter, then we are guaranteed further wars, more Israeli defeats, and probably, and I have to say this, an apocalyptic moment, one which could put the very survival of the state of Israel into question.
And the way I see this playing out, Alexander, I would love to be proven wrong again. I would love for the majority of Israelis to come to their senses and say, this is a people whom we can coexist and we must coexist. Let us resolve this by means of negotiation. I would love that to happen, as would so many other people around the world, including people who are very critical of Israel as I am. But I can't see that the Israeli public has any appetite for any kind of just coexistence with the Palestinian people. And if in fact they don't en masse adopt a more reasonable perspective towards their brothers and sisters in the Palestinian community, I think where this is going to end up, frankly, is in that dreaded demographic catastrophe that Israel's leaders have been talking about for so long, where the outflow of Jewish citizens of Israel greatly exceeds the inflow of people emigrating to Israel. And over time, the Palestinian population becomes numerically dominant, and simply suppressing them becomes practically impossible anymore. My sense is that that's where this is ultimately going to end up. Again, I hope people come to their senses and they adopt for the peaceful path of compromise and coexistence. Now, I want to move to a different subject in West Asia, and you've been very generous with your time. So this week, the death of President Raisi and of the foreign minister of Iran, it opens up so many questions, and there's so much time we could spend on that alone. But I want to focus on one thing in the time remaining to us, and that is the reaction of China and Russia. And I'd like to read to you the statements put out by President Xi and Vladimir Putin following. I'm not going to read the whole statements, but the key parts in my view. The first one by China's president was that Ebrahim Raisi's death, quote, unfortunate death, was a huge loss to the Iranian people and also caused the Chinese people to lose a good friend. With the joint efforts of both sides, the China-Iran comprehensive strategic partnership will continue to consolidate and develop. So that was his statement, or part of his statement. And then there was the statement of President Putin, who said, quote, Ebrahim Raisi was an outstanding politician whose entire life was devoted to serving his motherland. As a true friend of Russia, he made an invaluable personal contribution to the development of good neighborly relations between our countries and made great efforts to advance them to the level of strategic partnership. So one of the things that struck me about both these statements was the use of the word strategic. And maybe I'm reading too much into these statements, but I think amongst other things, this was intended as an implicit message to the West that China and Russia will not stand idly by if the US government and its allies try to take advantage of this situation to foment instability in Iran and try to effect yet again some kind of regime change operation, because frankly, the relationship with Iran is far too important for them, and that's something that they're simply not going to tolerate, which, if I'm right about this, highlights the extraordinary danger of what is happening in West Asia, because it could lead to a true world war with all the implications that entails. What is your reading of the reaction of China and Russia to the passing of Ebrahim Raisi? And do you think his passing is ultimately going to result in some kind of a meaningful change in the status of the relationship between Iran and these two extraordinarily powerful countries, China?
I think that there's a number of things to say here. The first is that 2023, the year that has just passed, for Iran was something of a miracle year. Iran managed to join the BRICS. It forged these strategic partnerships with China and Russia. The Russians, incidentally, have taken in their media and sometimes in the statements of their officials to referring to Iran as an ally, which goes beyond the use of the word strategic partnership. Iran has also agreed a major arms deal with Russia, which will result in Iran being supplied with Sukhoi 35 fighter jets and other weapons of that kind. And it's forged a major economic partnership with China. And of course, it's also agreed an economic partnership with India, which has infuriated the United States, by the way. It's achieved, with the help of Chinese mediation, a rapprochement with its old adversary, Saudi Arabia, which has joined the BRICS alongside it. And it has achieved a significant level of economic growth. I've been told that economic growth in Iran has been running at a rate of about 7% a year.
Wow.
So it was a miracle year. And a lot of the credit for that has to go to Ebrahim Raisi. He proved to be, much to some people's surprise, a very effective diplomat. I mean, he had no background or reputation in this, but he showed that he could work with Russian and Chinese leaders very successfully, that he could actually forge a relationship with the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. He proved a surprisingly able diplomat and a surprisingly able manager of Iran's economic system. However, he was not the leader of Iran. The leader of Iran remains Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme leader of the country and who is still obviously very much in place. And I think that the legacy of Raisi and of what he achieved, which is part of what the entire Iranian government achieved over the last couple of years, this forging of all of these relationships, I think that will continue beyond Raisi's death. Now, if the Russians have forged strategic partnerships with Iran, and if the Chinese have done the same, and if India is committed to economic links with Iran, and if Saudi Arabia has carried out a major rapprochement with Iran, what that demonstrates is that all of these countries see Iran now as a responsible and major player in the world system. And in terms of the Russians and the Chinese, and they talk about this quite openly, especially the Russians. They also now have this project of integrating what the Russians refer to as the Eurasian economies. They want to establish economic linkages, railway lines, other ports, all of these things. And there are very, very ambitious plans. I'm familiar with the Russian side of these plans more than the Chinese ones, but they are very ambitious. And Iran plays a central role in all of them. There's a plan by the Russians, for example, to develop links through Iran so that Russia could send, say, natural gas or oil to India directly through a land corridor, which passes in part through Iran. So they obviously now have a massive geopolitical and economic and trade investment in Iran. And you're absolutely right. They're not going to allow the United States to interfere with that. They want to retain Iran as a partner. They absolutely do not want it to be destabilized. They do not want to see color revolutions or anything like that happen in Iran. And of course, if there is an attack by the United States or Israel on Iran, then the Chinese and the Russians will strongly oppose it. And all of the regional states will also. Turkey will oppose it also, by the way, and Saudi Arabia will not look with favor upon it either. So Iran has broken out of the isolation that it found itself in for many years, and which existed recently. And the reason that has happened is because of the enormous change in the geopolitical environment. Countries like China and Russia, which at one time valued their relationship with the United States to the point where they were unwilling to forge close relations with countries that the United States opposed, like Iran and North Korea. They have now come to the conclusion that relations with the United States have become so impossible, so fraught with difficulty, that it makes no sense to continue to sacrifice potentially beneficial relations with these countries, like Iran and North Korea and others. So let's instead concentrate on developing those relationships. And if there are problems with the United States about that, well, there would have been problems anyway. So we might as well go ahead and do it. And I think that is the decision the Chinese and the Russians have made. And it is the decision um, that is going to stick. And it explains, as I said, why Iran last year had its miracle year.
Right. It's interesting on a regional level in West Asia, we've seen something similar happen to what we've seen on a global level in terms of the evolution of the Chinese-Russian relationship, where the excesses of Western governments and the hubris and the aggression of Western governments have driven China and Russia closer and closer together to the point where they've become an indomitable force. They can no longer, I mean, I don't know that they're in any kind of position to dominate the world. I don't believe that that's what they aspire to do, but they certainly now cannot be dominated. I think that that's clear to any sane person. And within West Asia itself, up until this genocide began, it seemed to me that both China and Russia, particularly Russia, were trying to maintain at least a civil relationship with Israel. Even Israel's rhetorical support for the Zelensky regime didn't cause a breakdown, as far as I could tell, in the relations between Russia and Israel. But Israel's behavior now has driven, I think, China and Russia even closer to Iran. So you've seen how these states, both on a regional level and global level, the West and its allies, are behaving in such extraordinarily aggressive and hubristic ways that they're actually hurting their own interests geopolitically by causing their adversaries to unite in opposition to them. Do you think there's some truth to that? Have you seen the attitude, do you sense that the attitude of Russia and China towards Israel itself has turned, if not hostile, certainly more adversarial than it was before this genocide? And I just want to add, despite what I said about, you know, the relations between China and Russia and Israel prior to the genocide, they did consistently vote, China and Russia, at the United Nations in favor of Palestinian rights. So it wasn't as if they were doing nothing to support the Palestinian cause. But it seems to me that this genocidal, reckless behavior on the part of Israel has basically killed any prospects of healthy relationships with the Russian Federation and China.
You're absolutely correct. Now, again, I know more about Russia because obviously I follow it more closely. But China, it's exactly the same. I'll speak a little bit about Russia. Now, of course, the Russians. One of the factors that had up to recently shaped their policies in the Middle East and their policy towards Israel was the major strategic blunder which they felt the Soviet Union made in the 1960s when it aligned itself very closely with the Arab countries against Israel and ended diplomatic relations with Israel. And they found that the Soviet alliances with the Arab countries actually didn't amount to very much. Egypt did its separate peace with Israel. The Soviets found themselves isolated, and they found that the Arab states also supported the insurgency against them that was being waged in Afghanistan. So the Russians said, we're not going to go there again. We're going to instead maintain equidistance between the Israelis and the Arab states because our relationship with the Arabs didn't work out well. And at the same time, we encountered many domestic and international problems with the West as a result of our problems with Israel, our adversarial relationship with Israel. So you had a long period when the Russians sought to maintain a kind of equidistance. They always supported Palestinian rights. You're quite right. They never withdrew from that. but they actually forged a fairly close relationship with Israel. And that evolved into a very close personal relationship between Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, I think it was in 2017, Putin actually invited Netanyahu to the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. You know, the biggest celebrations that you can imagine in Moscow. And Netanyahu attended them as the guest of honor. Vucic of Serbia was also there, but there was Netanyahu. Surprised many people. And there were some people who were even talking about a Russian-Israeli alliance on the back of that, which was never true. But it was a very, very close, very friendly relationship. What has happened is that the Gaza crisis has made that impossible for the Russians to sustain. Firstly, they have been horrified by the arrogance and the extremism and the maximalist behavior of the Israelis, and the way in which, from a Russian point of view, they have completely mismanaged the crisis in Gaza. And the Russians have been quite open about that. But beyond that, Russia, 20% of its population is Muslim. So it's, that's a major factor that must not be overlooked. And Russia also has simultaneously been working to develop its relations with many Muslim and Arab countries. It's forged the very close relationship with Iran, which we have been talking about. It's got a very close relationship indeed with Saudi Arabia. And again, the king of Saudi Arabia, the king and the crown prince of Saudi Arabia are on good personal terms with Putin. And, he was received there like a triumphant emperor when he went to Saudi Arabia and the UAE a few months ago.
Yes. And there's
of course,
Syria, of course, his relationship.
Syria, Egypt, Turkey, all of these countries, very close friends of Russia. So inevitably, the Russians have become more and more critical of what Israel is doing. And now they're not merely critical, they're straightforwardly opposed. And they've been working on the Security Council. They've been taking the lead in the Security Council to push for a ceasefire in Gaza there. They've been openly critical of Israeli policy. And they've also been very critical of American policy for supporting Israel in what Israel has been doing. And if you track Chinese decisions and policy statements, which I follow less, but I do follow to the same degree, you see the same arc, a situation where 10 years ago, China maintained, again, a kind of equidistance between Israel and the Arab states. This is not a region where China was wanted to be directly involved. They always opposed, as the Russians did, the regime change attempts in Syria. They always opposed the American interventions in Iraq, as the Russians also did. But this wasn't a central region of interest for China. But gradually, inexorably, the Chinese have also been pulled along because they see how important this region ultimately is, and how disruptive Israeli behavior has become. And again, I know that many people are very cynical about the Chinese and Russian governments, and they can be pretty ruthless in the way they conduct their affairs and in their pursuit of their own interests. But I think they've also been shocked, even despite that, by Israel's behavior in Gaza. There's a thing the Russians like to say is that unnecessary cruelty is an abhorrent thing. Necessary cruelty can sometimes be necessary, but when it becomes unnecessary, when it becomes as disproportionate and as extreme as it has become in terms of what Israel is doing, that is abhorrent. And I think the Russians feel that way, and I think the Chinese feel that way too.
Well, we in the West are witnessing what one might call a masterclass in not how to conduct a foreign policy. We have the misfortune of being ultimately the persons who are going to have to pay the price in terms of the disastrous thinking and complete lack of just basic sense of human decency on the part of our so-called leaders. I hope to have many more conversations with you, Alexander, about all of this. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I look forward to our next get-together.
My pleasure, my great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on May 22nd, 2024.